Question 1. The investigation demonstrates that a manufacturing facility, with a workforce comprising individuals of varying educational backgrounds and English proficiency levels, has experienced a noticeable increase in instances where employees are not consistently using provided hearing protection devices, HPD, during high-noise tasks. The facility's current hearing conservation training consists of an annual, one-hour presentation delivered by a supervisor, primarily using a PowerPoint slideshow with minimal interaction. The employer is seeking to improve compliance and reduce the risk of noise-induced hearing loss. Which of the following strategies best addresses the communication and training challenges to enhance employee understanding and adherence to the hearing conservation program? Option A. Implement a policy that mandates the use of HPDs and issues disciplinary warnings for any observed noncompliance, without altering the current training approach. Option B. Develop a multifaceted training program that includes visual aids, hands-on demonstrations of HPD selection and fit, short informational videos in multiple languages, and regular, brief refresher sessions integrated into team meetings, with periodic knowledge checks. Option C. Distribute a detailed written manual on hearing conservation to all employees and require them to sign a form acknowledging receipt. Option D. Increase the duration of the annual training session to 2 hours and add more technical details about audiometric testing procedures. Correct answer is B. Develop a multifaceted training program that includes visual aids, hands-on demonstrations of HPD selection and fit, short informational videos in multiple languages, and regular, brief refresher sessions integrated into team meetings, with periodic knowledge checks. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a common challenge in occupational hearing conservation, ensuring that critical safety information is understood and retained by a diverse workforce. This scenario is professionally challenging because the effectiveness of any hearing conservation program hinges on the ability of employees to comprehend and act upon the training provided. Failure to tailor communication and training can lead to noncompliance, increased risk of noise-induced hearing loss, and potential legal or regulatory repercussions for the employer. Careful judgment is required to select the most effective communication and training strategies that meet the needs of all employees, regardless of their background or learning style. The correct approach involves developing a comprehensive training program that utilizes multiple communication strategies and methods, tailored to the specific needs of the workforce. This includes using clear, concise language, incorporating visual aids to reinforce key messages, and employing diverse training methods such as hands-on demonstrations and interactive sessions. Regular training and evaluation are essential to ensure ongoing understanding and compliance with regulatory requirements. This approach aligns with the principles of effective adult learning and the regulatory mandate to provide adequate training and information to employees regarding workplace hazards and protective measures. As outlined in relevant occupational safety and health regulations, the focus is on ensuring comprehension and retention, not just delivery of information. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a single method, such as a brief lecture with minimal visual support, fails to account for varying learning styles and comprehension levels. This can lead to information being overlooked or misunderstood, directly contravening the regulatory requirement for effective communication and training. Another incorrect approach might involve infrequent training sessions, which can lead to knowledge decay and a decline in adherence to hearing conservation protocols. This neglects the need for ongoing reinforcement and updates, which are crucial for maintaining a robust safety culture. A third incorrect approach could be the absence of any evaluation mechanism to gauge training effectiveness. Without assessment, there is no way to confirm that employees have grasped the necessary information or to identify areas where training needs improvement, thereby failing to meet the spirit and letter of regulatory expectations for program efficacy. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, assess the target audience's demographics, literacy levels, and potential language barriers. Second, identify the key learning objectives and the essential information that must be conveyed. Third, select a variety of communication and training methods that are most likely to achieve these objectives for the identified audience. Fourth, plan for regular reinforcement and evaluation to ensure ongoing effectiveness and compliance. This iterative process ensures that the hearing conservation program is not only compliant, but also practically effective in protecting employee hearing. Question 2. During the evaluation of a worker reporting a persistent muffled sensation in one ear, which of the following approaches best reflects a comprehensive understanding of the outer ear's anatomy and physiology and its potential impact on hearing? Option A. Attribute the muffled sensation to potential noise-induced hearing loss and recommend immediate noise reduction measures without further physical examination. Option B. Prioritize an assessment of the middle ear's pressure equalization function via the eustachian tube, as muffled hearing is often indicative of middle ear pathology. Option C. Immediately proceed with pure tone audiometry and tympanometry, assuming the muffled sensation is a subjective interpretation of normal hearing. Option D. Focus on the patient's subjective report of a muffled sensation and conduct a thorough visual inspection of the pinna and external auditory canal, including assessment for cerumen accumulation, before proceeding with audiological testing. The correct answer is C. Immediately proceed with pure tone audiometry and tympanometry, assuming the muffled sensation is a subjective interpretation of normal hearing. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the need to accurately interpret subjective patient reports within the objective framework of audiological assessment, specifically concerning the outer ear's role in sound transmission and protection. The Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist, COHC, must integrate knowledge of the pinna's structure and function, the external auditory canal's properties, and cerumen's physiological role with the patient's subjective experience of hearing and comfort. Misinterpreting these subjective complaints could lead to an incomplete or inaccurate diagnosis, potentially impacting the effectiveness of hearing conservation programs and worker well-being. Correct approach involves a systematic assessment that begins with understanding the patient's subjective complaint and then correlating it with the known anatomy and physiology of the outer ear. This includes considering how the pinna's shape influences sound localization and collection, how the external auditory canal structure can affect sound conduction and the potential for blockage, and the normal physiological function of cerumen in protecting and lubricating the canal. The COHC should then proceed with a visual inspection of the outer ear and external auditory canal, followed by appropriate audiological tests to objectively evaluate the auditory system's function. This aligns with the COHC responsibility to conduct hearing evaluations and identify potential hearing impairments or related conditions, as outlined by professional standards and the implied scope of practice for occupational hearing conservation. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the patient's subjective report of a muffled sensation without further investigation, assuming it is solely due to ambient noise or a minor, insignificant issue. This fails to acknowledge the potential impact of outer ear conditions on hearing and comfort, and it neglects the COHC duty to thoroughly assess all reported symptoms. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately attribute the muffled sensation to a middle ear problem without first ruling out outer ear pathologies, such as significant cerumen impaction or external otitis, which can also cause similar subjective complaints and affect sound transmission. This bypasses a critical step in differential diagnosis and could lead to inappropriate or delayed treatment. Finally, focusing solely on audiometric thresholds without considering the patient's qualitative description of their hearing experience would be an incomplete assessment, as it fails to address the functional impact of any potential auditory system dysfunction. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured approach. First, actively listen to and document the patient's subjective complaints. Second, recall and apply knowledge of the relevant anatomy and physiology to hypothesize potential causes. Third, conduct a thorough physical examination of the outer ear and external auditory canal. Fourth, perform appropriate audiological tests to objectively assess hearing function. Fifth, integrate subjective and objective findings to formulate a diagnosis or determine the need for referral. This systematic process ensures that all aspects of the patient's auditory health are considered, leading to accurate and effective hearing conservation strategies. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, to evaluate proposed cost-saving measures that could impact the hearing conservation program, HCP. Management suggests reducing annual audiometric testing to once every 2 years for employees exposed at or above the OHCA action level, citing budgetary constraints. The COHC must determine the most appropriate course of action to ensure regulatory compliance and protect employee hearing, Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical responsibilities of a COHC? Option A. Agree to the proposed reduction in audiometric testing frequency to every 2 years, as management has indicated it is a significant cost-saving measure, and assume employees will report any noticeable hearing changes. Option B. Recommend that employees rely solely on hearing protection devices, HPD, for noise reduction and discontinue routine audiometric testing, as HPDs are the primary means of preventing noise-induced hearing loss. Option C. Inform management that the audiometric testing schedule can be adjusted based on their financial priorities, as long as some form of hearing monitoring is maintained, even if it deviates from the standard annual requirement. Option D. Explain to management that OSHA regulations, 29 CFR 1910-95, mandate annual audiometric testing for employees exposed at or above the action level, and that reducing this frequency would violate the standard, potentially leading to citations and increased risk of undetected hearing loss. Propose exploring alternative cost-saving measures within the HCP that do not compromise core requirements. Correct answer is D. Explain to management that OSHA regulations, 29 CFR 1910-95, mandate annual audiometric testing for employees exposed at or above the action level, and that reducing this frequency would violate the standard, potentially leading to citations and increased risk of undetected hearing loss. Propose exploring alternative cost-saving measures within the HCP that do not compromise core requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial pressures of a company with the long-term health and safety obligations mandated by OSHA. The audiologist, as the Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist (COHC), is ethically and legally bound to uphold the principles of the Hearing Conservation Program, HCP, as outlined in 29 CFR 1910-95. Even when faced with management's desire to cut costs, the core of the challenge lies in prioritizing regulatory compliance and employee well-being over potential short-term financial gains. Careful judgment is required to navigate this conflict without compromising the integrity of the HCP or the health of the employees. The correct approach involves a proactive and educational strategy. This entails clearly communicating to management the specific regulatory requirements of OSHA HCP, including the necessity of annual audiometric testing for all employees exposed to noise levels at or above the action level, 85 dB. It also requires explaining the purpose and effectiveness of engineering and administrative controls, and the limitations of hearing protection devices, HPD, as a sole control measure. The audiologist must emphasize that failing to conduct annual audiometric testing, as required by 29 CFR 1910-95G, can lead to undetected hearing loss, increased risk of future claims, and potential OSHA citations. This approach prioritizes employee health, regulatory compliance, and the long-term sustainability of the HCP by demonstrating its value and necessity. An incorrect approach would be to immediately agree to the proposed reduction in audiometric testing frequency. This directly violates OSHA requirement for annual testing and demonstrates a failure to uphold professional responsibilities as a COHC. Ethically, it prioritizes management's financial concerns over employee safety, potentially leading to irreversible hearing damage and a compromised HCP. Another incorrect approach would be to suggest relying solely on hearing protection devices without addressing the noise exposure itself. While HPDs are a component of an HCP, OSHA hierarchy of controls prioritizes engineering and administrative controls. Relying exclusively on HPDs, especially if they are not properly selected, fitted, and maintained, can be ineffective and still leaves employees at risk, violating the comprehensive nature of the HCP. A further incorrect approach would be to simply state that the testing cannot be reduced without providing a clear explanation of the regulatory basis and the potential consequences. While the intention might be to comply, this lacks the strategic communication and educational component necessary to influence management and ensure understanding of the program's importance. It fails to demonstrate the value of the HCP and may lead to future conflicts. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the specific regulatory requirements, OSHA 29 CFR 1910-95. 2. Assessing the potential health impacts on employees. 3. evaluating the financial implications of both compliance and noncompliance, including potential fines, increased workers' compensation claims, and decreased productivity due to hearing loss. 4. Developing a clear, data-driven communication strategy to present the findings and recommendations to management, emphasizing the benefits of a robust HCP. 5. Documenting all communications and decisions. Question 4. The risk matrix shows a manufacturing facility with multiple work areas exhibiting noise levels ranging from 85 dBA to 105 dBA, with intermittent impulse noise present in some areas. Employees perform tasks requiring manual dexterity and communication with colleagues. What is the most appropriate approach for selecting hearing protection devices, HPD, for these employees? Option A. Prioritize the least expensive HPDs that meet a minimum NRR threshold, ensuring cost-effectiveness for the company. Option B. Conduct a thorough noise assessment. Evaluate the attenuation characteristics of various HPD types, foam, pre-molded, custom-molded earplugs, and earmuffs, against the specific noise spectrum and impulse noise. Consider employee comfort and fit for prolonged wear, and assess workplace factors like communication needs and compatibility with other PPE before making a final selection and providing training. Option C. Allow employees to choose any HPD they find comfortable, as long as it is readily available in the workplace, assuming their comfort will lead to proper use. Option D. Select earplugs with the highest noise reduction rating, NRR, available, regardless of type, and distribute them to all employees. The correct answer is D. Select earplugs with the highest noise reduction rating, NRR, available, regardless of type, and distribute them to all employees. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the occupational hearing conservationist to balance multiple, sometimes competing, factors when selecting hearing protection devices, HPD, for a diverse workforce exposed to varying noise levels. The challenge lies in moving beyond a one-size-fits-all approach and ensuring that the chosen HPDs are not only effective in noise reduction, but also comfortable, practical for the specific tasks, and compliant with regulatory requirements, ultimately promoting consistent and correct use. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the workplace noise environment, the specific tasks performed by employees, and the individual needs and preferences of the workers. This includes considering the noise reduction rating, NRR, of the HPDs as a primary indicator of their potential effectiveness. But critically, it also necessitates evaluating attenuation characteristics relevant to the specific noise spectrum, ensuring a comfortable fit for prolonged wear, and factoring in workplace considerations such as communication needs, hygiene, and the potential for interference with other personal protective equipment. This holistic approach aligns with the ethical responsibility of the occupational hearing conservationist to protect worker hearing, while also ensuring the practicality and usability of the chosen HPDs, thereby maximizing compliance and effectiveness. Regulatory frameworks, such as those outlined by OSHA in the U.S., mandate the provision of effective hearing protection and training, emphasizing the employer's responsibility to select HPDs that are adequate for the noise exposure and to ensure their proper use. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that solely focuses on the highest NRR without considering comfort or workplace suitability is flawed. While a high NRR is desirable, an HPD that is uncomfortable or impractical for the specific work tasks will likely be worn improperly or not at all, rendering its high NRR ineffective. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for providing effective hearing protection, as effectiveness is contingent on consistent and correct use. An approach that prioritizes only the lowest cost HPD is also professionally unacceptable. Cost should not be the primary determinant when worker hearing is at stake. Selecting an inexpensive HPD that offers inadequate noise reduction or is uncomfortable for workers can lead to overexposure to noise and potential hearing loss, violating both ethical obligations and regulatory mandates for providing adequate protection. An approach that relies solely on employee preference without an objective assessment of noise levels and HPD effectiveness is also problematic. While employee comfort and preference are important for compliance, they must be informed by a professional evaluation of the noise environment and the attenuation capabilities of the HPDs. Allowing preference to override scientifically determined needs for protection can result in inadequate noise reduction and a failure to meet regulatory standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a thorough noise assessment. This assessment informs the selection of HPDs with appropriate attenuation characteristics for the identified noise levels and spectrum. Subsequently, the occupational hearing conservationist must consider the practical aspects of HPD use in the specific work environment, including comfort, fit, and compatibility with other PPE. Employee input should be sought regarding comfort and fit, but this input should be integrated into the overall selection process, not dictated in isolation. Finally, comprehensive training on proper fitting, use, inspection, and maintenance is crucial to ensure the selected HPDs provide their intended level of protection. Question 5. Comparative studies suggest that while various engineering controls exist for noise reduction, the most effective and sustainable approach often involves addressing the noise at its origin. Considering the hierarchy of controls and the goal of minimizing occupational noise exposure, which of the following strategies best reflects a proactive and compliant approach to implementing engineering controls for noise reduction in a manufacturing environment? Option A. Relying exclusively on the provision and mandatory use of personal hearing protection devices for all employees working in noisy areas, without significant investment in engineering controls. Option B. Focusing primarily on implementing administrative controls, such as rotating employees through noisy areas to limit individual exposure duration, as a primary engineering control strategy. Option C. Implementing path control measures, such as installing acoustic barriers around noisy equipment, as the sole engineering solution without evaluating source control options. Option D. Prioritizing the investigation and implementation of source control measures, such as modifying machinery or processes to reduce noise generation, before considering other control methods. The correct answer is D. Prioritizing the investigation and implementation of source control measures, such as modifying machinery or processes to reduce noise generation, before considering other control methods. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate needs of production with the long-term health and safety of employees, all within the constraints of regulatory compliance and economic feasibility. A certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, must navigate the complexities of implementing engineering controls, which often involve significant investment and operational adjustments, while ensuring these controls are effective and sustainable. The COHC role is to advocate for the most protective measures, grounded in scientific principles and regulatory mandates, while also being a practical advisor to management. The correct approach involves prioritizing source control as the most effective and sustainable method for noise reduction, aligning with the hierarchy of controls mandated by occupational safety regulations. This method directly addresses the origin of the noise, preventing its generation or significantly reducing its intensity before it can propagate. Ethically, this demonstrates a commitment to employee well-being by implementing the most robust protective measures. Regulatory justification stems from the principle that eliminating or minimizing hazards at the source is the preferred strategy in occupational health and safety frameworks, such as those enforced by OSHA in the U.S., which emphasize the hierarchy of controls. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on receiver control, such as mandating hearing protection for all employees without first exploring source or path controls. This is ethically problematic as it places the burden of protection on the individual employee rather than the employer mitigating the hazard at its source. It also fails to meet the spirit, and often the letter, of regulations that require employers to implement engineering and administrative controls before or in conjunction with personal protective equipment, PPE. Another incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on path control without considering source control. While barriers and enclosures can reduce noise transmission, they may not be as effective or cost-efficient as addressing the noise at its origin, and they can sometimes create other operational or maintenance challenges. This approach might be seen as a less proactive and potentially less effective strategy for long-term noise management. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough noise assessment to identify sources and levels. This should be followed by an evaluation of potential controls, starting with source control options, then path control, and finally receiver control, always considering feasibility, cost-effectiveness, and regulatory requirements. A cost-benefit analysis should weigh the costs of implementing controls against the costs of noise-induced hearing loss, including medical expenses, lost productivity, and potential litigation, as well as the ethical imperative to protect worker health. Regular monitoring and maintenance of implemented controls are crucial to ensure their continued effectiveness. Question 6. The control framework reveals that an employee's audiometric test shows a significant shift in hearing thresholds compared to their baseline. The employee has been exposed to noise levels within the action level for several months, with occasional excursions above it. The OHC needs to determine the most appropriate initial interpretation of this shift within the context of preventing noise-induced hearing loss. NIL. Which of the following interpretations best aligns with the regulatory requirements for distinguishing between temporary and permanent hearing changes? Option A. The shift is primarily a non-auditory effect of noise exposure, such as increased stress, and should be addressed through stress management techniques rather than audiometric follow-up. Option B. The shift requires further investigation to determine if it represents a temporary threshold shift, TTS, that is recovering, or if it is indicative of a permanent threshold shift, PTS, considering the noise exposure history and potential individual susceptibility factors. Option C. The shift is definitively a permanent threshold shift, PTS, requiring immediate removal from noise and medical evaluation, as any shift indicates irreversible damage. Option D. The shift is likely a temporary threshold shift, TTS, that will resolve with adequate rest, and no further action is needed unless subsequent tests show a persistent decline. The correct answer is C. The shift is definitively a permanent threshold shift, PTS, requiring immediate removal from noise and medical evaluation, as any shift indicates irreversible damage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an occupational hearing conservationist, OHC, to interpret and apply complex regulatory requirements regarding noise exposure and its effects, specifically concerning the distinction between temporary and permanent threshold shifts. The OHC must not only understand the physiological mechanisms of noise-induced hearing loss, NIL, but also how these relate to regulatory compliance and worker protection. Misinterpreting these concepts can lead to inadequate hearing conservation programs, potentially resulting in irreversible hearing damage for employees and regulatory noncompliance for the employer. The OHC must exercise careful judgment in assessing the implications of noise exposure data within the established legal and ethical framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves accurately differentiating between temporary threshold shift, TTS, and permanent threshold shift, PTS, based on the established regulatory definitions and the temporal nature of the hearing threshold recovery. TTS is a temporary reduction in hearing sensitivity that typically recovers within a period specified or implied by regulatory guidelines, e.g., 14-16 hours of quiet. PTS, conversely, is an irreversible loss of hearing sensitivity resulting from cumulative damage to the cochlea, often due to repeated or intense noise exposure. The regulatory framework for occupational hearing conservation, such as that established by OSHA in the U.S., mandates specific actions based on these distinctions. For instance, a confirmed PTS necessitates medical evaluation and potential removal from hazardous noise environments, whereas TTS, while a warning sign, may not immediately trigger such stringent interventions if recovery is complete and consistent. The OHC's role is to monitor trends, identify potential PTS, and ensure the hearing conservation program effectively prevents its development, aligning with the overarching goal of protecting workers' hearing as mandated by law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to treat all instances of reduced hearing sensitivity as indicative of permanent damage, regardless of the recovery period. This oversimplifies the physiological response to noise and leads to unnecessary interventions, potentially causing undue alarm and administrative burden, without a clear regulatory basis for such immediate, drastic action. Fails to acknowledge the body's natural recovery mechanisms for TTS, which is a distinct and regulated phenomenon. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss any hearing threshold changes that occur after noise exposure as solely temporary, without considering the cumulative effects of repeated exposures or the potential for underlying susceptibility factors. This ignores the progressive nature of NIL and the regulatory emphasis on preventing the transition from TTS to PTS. It fails to account for factors like age, genetics, or pre-existing conditions that can increase an individual's susceptibility to permanent damage, even from noise levels that might only cause TTS in others. A third incorrect approach would be to focus solely on non-auditory effects of noise, such as stress or annoyance, when assessing hearing conservation program effectiveness. While these effects are important considerations in workplace well-being and can be influenced by noise, they do not directly address the primary regulatory mandate of preventing noise-induced hearing loss. The regulatory framework for hearing conservation is specifically designed to protect auditory function, and while non-auditory effects are acknowledged, they are secondary to the core objective of preventing NIL. Professional reasoning. Professionals in occupational hearing conservation must adopt a systematic, evidence-based approach grounded in regulatory requirements. This involves 1. Understanding the specific definitions and criteria for TTS and PTS as outlined in the relevant regulatory framework, e.g., OSHA Hearing Conservation Standard. 2. Accurately interpreting audiometric data, paying close attention to the timing of measurements relative to noise exposure and the observed recovery patterns. 3. Considering all influencing factors on hearing susceptibility, as mandated by regulations, when evaluating an individual's risk profile. 4. Implementing the hearing conservation program in accordance with regulatory mandates, including appropriate follow-up actions for identified threshold shifts. 5. Maintaining clear and accurate documentation to support all assessments and interventions. This structured approach ensures compliance, protects worker health, and upholds professional ethical standards. Question 7. Investigation of a manufacturing facility's noise environment reveals that workers are exposed to intermittent loud machinery noise interspersed with periods of lower-level background noise throughout an 8-hour shift. To assess potential hearing loss risk and determine the adequacy of current hearing protection, which of the following measurement and analysis approaches best adheres to occupational hearing conservation principles and regulatory frameworks? Option A. Measure the sound pressure levels using a Type 2 sound level meter with Z weighting during a 15-minute period when machinery is operating at its highest output. Option B. Rely on subjective reports from workers regarding their perception of noise loudness and the effectiveness of their hearing protection. Option C. Conduct spot measurements of the peak sound pressure level, L peak, during the loudest machinery operation, and compare these values to established hearing protection device, HPD, noise reduction ratings. Option D. Utilize an integrating sound level meter or a decimeter to measure the equivalent continuous sound level, LEC, over the entire 8-hour work shift, and then calculate the time-weighted average, TWA, exposure. The correct answer is C. Conduct spot measurements of the peak sound pressure level, L peak, during the loudest machinery operation, and compare these values to established hearing protection device, HPD noise reduction ratings. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an occupational hearing conservationist to interpret real-world noise data and apply fundamental principles of sound and noise measurement to ensure worker safety. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate measurement strategy and understanding the implications of different noise descriptors, all within the framework of regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting data, which could lead to inadequate hearing protection programs and potential regulatory violations. The correct approach involves selecting a measurement strategy that accurately reflects the noise exposure experienced by workers over their entire shift, using appropriate instrumentation and descriptors. This approach is best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of occupational noise assessment and the regulatory requirements for establishing effective hearing conservation programs. Specifically, using an integrating sound level meter or a decimeter to capture the equivalent continuous sound level, LEC, over a representative period provides a comprehensive measure of daily noise dose, which is crucial for determining the need for a type of hearing protection. This directly addresses the regulatory mandate to protect workers from hazardous noise exposure by quantifying their actual exposure. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on spot measurements of maximum sound levels, Lmax, or peak sound pressure levels, L peak, without considering the duration of exposure. While these descriptors provide information about the loudest moments, they do not represent the total noise energy a worker is exposed to throughout their shift. This failure to account for the time-weighted average exposure is a significant regulatory and ethical lapse, as it can underestimate the risk of noise-induced hearing loss. Another incorrect approach would be to use a sound level meter without appropriate frequency weighting, such as Z-weighting, when the primary concern is the potential for hearing damage. Z-weighting represents the flat frequency response of the meter. A-weighting is specifically designed to approximate the human ear sensitivity to different frequencies at typical industrial noise levels. Failing to use A-weighting, or other relevant weightings as specified by regulations, when assessing noise for hearing conservation purposes, leads to an inaccurate representation of the noise's potential to cause hearing loss, thus failing to meet regulatory standards for risk assessment. A third incorrect approach would be to assume that the presence of barriers or specific environmental conditions, like temperature or humidity, inherently negates the need for detailed noise measurement. While these factors can affect sound propagation, they do not eliminate the need to quantify actual noise exposure levels. Ignoring measurement due to assumptions about environmental mitigation is a failure to adhere to the fundamental requirement of assessing noise exposure directly. Professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the regulatory requirements for noise assessment and hearing conservation in the specific jurisdiction. 2. Identifying the types of noise present and the work activities that generate them. 3. Selecting appropriate instrumentation, e.g., integrating sound level meter, decimeter, and measurement parameters, e.g., lectoire, that will accurately capture worker exposure. 4. Conducting measurements over a representative period of the work shift. 5. Analyzing the data using appropriate noise descriptors and comparing them to regulatory action levels and permissible exposure limits. 6. Implementing necessary controls, including hearing protection, based on the analyzed data. Question 8. Stakeholder feedback indicates a new employee's baseline audiogram is scheduled for tomorrow, but the designated testing room is currently unavailable due to unexpected maintenance. The supervisor suggests conducting the test in a quieter corner of the production floor, assuring you that it's not that loud and that the employee needs to start their onboarding process immediately. As a certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Politely decline the supervisor's suggestion and explain that audiometric testing must be conducted in a sound-treated environment as per regulatory requirements, proposing to reschedule the test for when the designated room is available or to find an alternative approved testing location. Option B. Conduct only the air conduction portion of the audiometric test in the production floor area, as this is less sensitive to ambient noise than bone conduction or speech audiometry. Option C. Proceed with the audiometric testing in the suggested location on the production floor, documenting the deviation from standard procedure due to the supervisor's directive. Option D. Inform the supervisor that you will proceed with the test in the production floor area, but will use a higher decibel level for the pure tones to compensate for the ambient noise. Correct answer is A. Politely decline the supervisor's suggestion and explain that audiometric testing must be conducted in a sound-treated environment as per regulatory requirements, proposing to reschedule the test for when the designated room is available or to find an alternative approved testing location. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for accurate audiometric data with potential external pressures that could compromise the integrity of the testing process. The Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist, COHC, must uphold ethical standards and regulatory compliance above all else. Careful judgment is required to navigate the request for a deviation from established protocols. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the established audiometric testing procedures, including test environment requirements and equipment calibration, as mandated by the relevant U.S. regulatory framework for occupational hearing conservation. This ensures the validity and reliability of the baseline audiogram, which is crucial for establishing a true measure of an employee's hearing at the start of their employment. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes the employee's health and safety by providing an accurate assessment, and it is regulatorily compliant by following established guidelines for audiometric testing. The purpose of baseline audiograms is to detect any pre-existing hearing loss, and any deviation from standard procedures could mask or misrepresent this. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the audiometric testing in a noisy environment. This directly violates the test environment requirements stipulated by regulations, such as those outlined by OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, for audiometric testing. A noisy environment compromises the accuracy of pure-tone audiometry by masking the presented tones, leading to unreliable results and potentially misclassifying the employee's hearing status. This failure to adhere to environmental standards is a significant regulatory and ethical breach. Another incorrect approach would be to use a non-calibrated audiometer. Equipment calibration is a fundamental requirement for ensuring the accuracy of audiometric measurements. Using an uncalibrated device, as per regulatory guidelines, renders the audiogram invalid. This not only fails to meet the purpose of establishing a reliable baseline, but also poses an ethical risk by providing potentially misleading information about the employee's hearing health. A third incorrect approach would be to skip certain test frequencies or alter the test protocol without a valid, documented reason and supervisory approval. The established test protocols and frequencies are designed to comprehensively assess hearing across the range most relevant to occupational noise exposure. Deviating from these protocols without proper justification undermines the integrity of the audiogram and its ability to serve its intended purpose of monitoring hearing health. This constitutes a regulatory failure and an ethical lapse in professional responsibility. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. When faced with a request that deviates from established protocols, the COHC must first identify the specific regulation or ethical principle being challenged. The primary responsibility is to ensure the integrity and accuracy of the audiometric data. If a deviation is requested, the COHC should explain the regulatory and ethical reasons why the standard protocol must be followed. If there is a genuine, documented need for an alternative approach, this should be discussed with appropriate supervisors and potentially regulatory bodies, ensuring that any approved deviation still meets the core objectives of accurate hearing assessment and monitoring. Question 9. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a comprehensive hearing conservation program that includes the assessment and control of both noise and vibration, due to their known synergistic effects on hearing, is more effective in preventing long-term hearing loss than a program solely focused on noise. A manufacturing plant has identified areas with high noise levels and significant hand-arm vibration exposure for workers operating specific machinery. The COHC is tasked with developing the hearing conservation program. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical obligations for protecting workers' hearing in this scenario? Option A. Conduct a thorough assessment of both noise and vibration exposures. Evaluate their potential synergistic effects on hearing, and implement integrated control strategies that address both hazards, including appropriate HPD selection and engineering controls for vibration where feasible. Option B. Recommend that the company address vibration separately through a different safety program, assuming that meeting individual noise exposure limits will adequately protect workers' hearing. Option C. Prioritize noise control measures and HPDs, and only consider vibration if a worker specifically complains of hearing difficulties that cannot be attributed to noise alone. Option D. Focus exclusively on implementing a noise reduction program and providing hearing protection devices, HPD, that meet the noise reduction requirements, while disregarding the vibration exposure as it is not the primary focus of standard hearing conservation regulations. The correct answer is D. Focus exclusively on implementing a noise reduction program and providing hearing protection devices, HPD, that meet the noise reduction requirements, while disregarding the vibration exposure as it is not the primary focus of standard hearing conservation regulations. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, to consider the complex interplay of multiple workplace stressors on hearing, moving beyond the isolated assessment of noise. The synergistic effect of noise and vibration can lead to a greater risk of hearing damage than either factor alone, necessitating a comprehensive approach to risk assessment and control. The COHC must not only understand the individual impacts of noise and vibration, but also their combined potential for harm, which is often underestimated. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of both noise and vibration exposures, recognizing their potential for synergistic effects on hearing. This approach aligns with the principles of occupational health and safety, which mandate employers to identify and control all workplace hazards that could cause harm. Specifically, regulatory frameworks for hearing conservation, such as those overseen by OSHA in the U.S., emphasize the employer's responsibility to protect employees from all recognized hazards. While OSHA's primary focus for hearing conservation is noise, the broader mandate to ensure a safe and healthful working environment implicitly includes addressing other contributing factors like vibration when they demonstrably impact hearing. Best practice dictates that when vibration is present and potentially exacerbates noise-induced hearing loss, it must be evaluated and managed. This includes understanding vibration measurement techniques and relevant exposure limits, even if specific combined noise-vibration hearing loss standards are not as explicitly defined as noise-only standards. The ethical obligation of the COHC is to advocate for the most protective measures for the employee's hearing health. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on noise levels and disregard the presence of significant vibration. This fails to acknowledge the synergistic effects that can amplify hearing damage. Ethically, this is a dereliction of duty, as it overlooks a contributing hazard. From a regulatory perspective, while specific combined noise-vibration hearing loss standards might be less detailed than noise-only standards, the General Duty Clause of occupational safety regulations requires employers to address all recognized hazards. Ignoring vibration when it is known to interact with noise and potentially worsen hearing loss would be a violation of this broader responsibility. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that if individual noise and vibration exposure limits are met, there is no risk. This overlooks the scientific evidence of synergistic effects, where the combined impact is greater than the sum of individual impacts. This approach is scientifically unsound and ethically questionable, as it prioritizes compliance with individual metrics over the holistic protection of employee health. A third incorrect approach would be to defer all vibration assessment and control to a separate specialist without integrating it into the overall hearing conservation program. While specialized expertise is valuable, the COHC is responsible for the comprehensive assessment of hearing risk. This includes understanding how all relevant workplace factors contribute to that risk and ensuring that control measures are coordinated. Failing to integrate vibration assessment into the hearing conservation program means that a critical component of hearing risk management is being siloed, potentially leading to gaps in protection. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a hierarchical approach. 1. Hazard identification. Proactively identify all potential hazards, including noise and vibration, that could affect hearing. 2. Risk assessment. Evaluate the risk posed by each hazard individually and, crucially, consider their potential combined effects. This involves understanding the scientific literature on synergistic impacts. 3. Control measures. Implement control measures that address both noise and vibration, prioritizing elimination or substitution, followed by engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. 4. Monitoring and review. Continuously monitor exposure levels and the effectiveness of control measures, and review the program regularly to incorporate new scientific findings or changes in workplace conditions. 5. Communication and training. Ensure employees are informed about all identified hazards and the measures in place to protect them. Question 10. The review process indicates that an audiometric technician has been diligently conducting hearing tests for employees exposed to occupational noise. However, the technician has only been retaining audiometric records for 1 year and has not been reporting any identified standard threshold shifts, SDS, to OSHA, although they have been informing the affected workers verbally about their results. Which of the following actions best aligns with OSHA record-keeping and reporting requirements for a hearing conservation program? Option A. Retain audiometric records for the duration of employment plus 30 years. Verbally inform workers of SDS, and do not report SDS to OSHA as long as the worker is informed. Option B. Retain audiometric records for the duration of employment plus 30 years. Record SDS on the employee's noise exposure record, and report SDS to OSHA if the employee is on the OSHA 300 log. Option C. Retain audiometric records for 5 years. Verbally inform workers of SDS, and report SDS to OSHA annually. Option D. Continue retaining records for 1 year. Verbally inform workers of SDS, and do not report SDS to OSHA as only recordable injuries are logged. The correct answer is D. Continue retaining records for 1 year, verbally inform workers of SDS, and do not report SDS to OSHA as only recordable injuries are logged. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a meticulous understanding of OSHA record-keeping and reporting regulations for occupational hearing conservation programs. The audiometric technician must balance the immediate needs of worker notification with the long-term requirements for data retention and reporting, all while ensuring compliance with specific OSHA standards. Failure to adhere to these requirements can result in regulatory penalties and compromise the integrity of the hearing conservation program. The correct approach involves accurately documenting all audiometric test results, identifying and reporting standard threshold shifts, SDS, to OSHA as required, and promptly informing affected workers of their results and any identified SDS. This aligns directly with OSHA 29 CFR 1910-95 requirements for record keeping and reporting. Specifically, audiometric test records must be maintained for the duration of employment plus 30 years, and any SDS must be recorded on the employee's current noise exposure record and reported to OSHA if the employee is on the OSHA 300 log. Prompt notification to workers is also a critical component of effective hearing conservation, enabling them to take appropriate action. An incorrect approach would be to only retain records for a shorter period, such as 1 year, as this directly violates OSHA 29 CFR 1910-95 requirement for retention of audiometric records. Another incorrect approach would be to fail to report an SDS to OSHA when required, which is a violation of 29 CFR 1904-12 and 1910-95 Furthermore, neglecting to inform workers of their audiometric results and any identified SDS, even if records are maintained and reported to OSHA, undermines the program's effectiveness and worker engagement, which is an ethical failure in professional practice. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the specific OSHA record-keeping and reporting mandates applicable to their hearing conservation program. This involves consulting 29 CFR 1910-95 and 29 CFR 1904. They should then establish robust internal procedures for data collection, storage, and reporting that are demonstrably compliant with these regulations. Regular audits of record-keeping practices and reporting procedures are essential to identify and rectify any deviations from compliance. When an SDS is identified, the professional must follow a clear, documented protocol for recording, reporting, and worker notification. Question 11. Risk assessment procedures indicate a need to explore advancements in hearing protection devices, HPD, and audiometric testing for an established occupational hearing conservation program. Considering the regulatory framework of the United States, which of the following approaches best aligns with ensuring continued compliance and effectiveness? Option A. Evaluate emerging HPD technologies, such as smart HPDs and active noise cancellation, based on their documented noise reduction ratings, NRR, and their ability to meet or exceed the exposure limits set by OSHA, and assess automated and teleaudiometry for their validated accuracy and reliability in meeting diagnostic and monitoring requirements as per regulatory standards. Option B. Implement smart HPDs and active noise cancellation without specific validation of their noise reduction performance against OSHA standards, and adopt teleaudiometry based on vendor claims of convenience and efficiency. Option C. Prioritize the adoption of smart HPDs with advanced connectivity features and automated audiometry systems that offer remote testing capabilities, assuming these innovations inherently improve program outcomes. Option D. Focus on integrating HPDs that offer the highest level of noise attenuation, regardless of their technological sophistication, and continue using traditional, in-person audiometry to avoid the perceived risks of new technologies. The correct answer is C. Prioritize the adoption of smart HPDs with advanced connectivity features and automated audiometry systems that offer remote testing capabilities, assuming these innovations inherently improve program outcomes. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the rapid evolution of hearing protection technology and audiometric assessment methods. A certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, must navigate the integration of these emerging technologies into existing hearing conservation programs while ensuring compliance with regulatory standards and maintaining the effectiveness of the program. The challenge lies in discerning which advancements offer genuine improvements in noise exposure assessment and protection, and which may introduce complexities or potential pitfalls without clear regulatory guidance or established best practices. Careful judgment is required to balance innovation with established safety protocols and the practicalities of implementation in diverse workplace environments. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of emerging technologies against established regulatory requirements and the specific needs of the workplace. This includes researching the efficacy and reliability of smart HPDs and active noise cancellation technologies in reducing noise exposure to levels compliant with OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration standards, and assessing the accuracy and validity of automated and teleaudiometry in meeting the diagnostic and monitoring requirements of a hearing conservation program. The COHC must consult relevant OSHA regulations, e.g. 29 CFR 1910-95, and any available guidance from NIOSH, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or other authoritative bodies to determine if these technologies can be reliably used to meet or exceed the program's objectives. This approach prioritizes worker safety and regulatory compliance by ensuring that any adopted technology demonstrably contributes to effective hearing loss prevention and accurate audiometric monitoring as mandated by law. Incorrect approaches analysis. Adopting smart HPDs solely based on their advanced features without verifying their noise reduction capabilities against regulatory standards is an incorrect approach. This fails to ensure that the devices provide adequate protection as required by OSHA, potentially leaving workers exposed to hazardous noise levels. Similarly, implementing active noise cancellation without understanding its limitations in different noise environments or its interaction with passive attenuation could lead to inadequate protection or overprotection, both of which are non-compliant. Implementing automated or teleaudiometry without validating their accuracy and reliability against established audiometric testing protocols and regulatory requirements for diagnostic accuracy is also an incorrect approach. This could result in misdiagnoses, inaccurate baseline or monitoring audiograms, and ultimately, a failure to identify and manage noise-induced hearing loss effectively, violating the core principles of a hearing conservation program. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that prioritizes evidence-based decision-making and regulatory adherence. This involves 1. Identifying the specific hearing conservation program goals and regulatory requirements, e.g., OSHA standards. 2. Researching emerging technologies, focusing on their documented performance, reliability, and validation data. 3. Evaluating how these technologies align with or enhance the ability to meet regulatory mandates and program objectives. 4. Consulting relevant professional organizations and regulatory guidance for best practices and recommendations. 5. Conducting pilot studies or trials where appropriate to assess real-world effectiveness and user acceptance before full implementation. 6. Continuously monitoring the performance of adopted technologies and updating program protocols as needed. Question 12. Assessment of the effectiveness of an employer's administrative controls for noise reduction in a manufacturing facility, where the primary goal is to comply with OSHA hearing conservation standards, will most accurately reflect a robust program if it includes which of the following combinations of strategies. Option A. Implementing a work schedule that rotates employees through noisy areas to limit individual exposure time, clearly labeling all areas exceeding permissible noise exposure limits with appropriate warning signs, and conducting annual training sessions covering noise hazards, protective measures, and the facility's hearing conservation program. Option B. Posting general warning signs at the entrance to the facility indicating the presence of noise, and relying on employees to self-manage their time in noisy areas. Option C. Implementing a strict work rotation schedule without any accompanying signage or specific employee training on noise hazards. Option D. Conducting a single, comprehensive training session on noise hazards at the time of hire, and assuming employees will naturally avoid prolonged exposure in noisy areas. The correct answer is A. Implementing a work schedule that rotates employees through noisy areas to limit individual exposure time, clearly labeling all areas exceeding permissible noise exposure limits with appropriate warning signs, and conducting annual training sessions covering noise hazards, protective measures, and the facility's hearing conservation program. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in occupational hearing conservation, balancing the effectiveness of administrative controls with practical operational constraints and employee engagement. The challenge lies in ensuring that chosen methods are not only compliant with regulatory requirements, but also genuinely reduce noise exposure and are sustainable within the workplace. Careful judgment is required to select and implement controls that are both effective and feasible. The correct approach involves a comprehensive strategy that integrates multiple administrative controls, focusing on both exposure reduction and robust communication. This includes implementing work scheduling to limit individual employee exposure time in noisy areas, clearly posting warning signs in hazardous zones, and providing regular, content-specific training on noise hazards and protective measures. This approach aligns with the principles of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, standards for noise exposure, specifically 29 CFR 1910-95, which mandates these types of controls as part of a hearing conservation program. The regulatory framework emphasizes a hierarchy of controls, with administrative controls being a crucial component when engineering controls are not feasible or sufficient. Effective training and hazard communication are ethically imperative to ensure employees understand risks and their rights and responsibilities. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on posting warning signs without implementing any measures to limit exposure time or provide training. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for active noise reduction and employee education, as mandated by OSHA. It creates a false sense of compliance while leaving employees inadequately protected. Another incorrect approach would be to implement work rotation without clear communication or signage, leaving employees unaware of the specific hazards or the rationale behind the scheduling changes, which undermines the effectiveness of the training component and can lead to confusion and resistance. Focusing only on training without practical implementation of exposure reduction measures like scheduling or signage is also insufficient, as it addresses awareness but not the direct reduction of exposure. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic evaluation of the workplace noise environment, identification of specific noise sources and exposure patterns, and consideration of operational realities. The process should involve consulting the relevant OSHA regulations, assessing the feasibility and effectiveness of various administrative controls, and engaging with employees to ensure buy-in and understanding. A layered approach, combining multiple administrative controls, is generally the most effective and compliant strategy. Question 13. Upon reviewing the audiometric results of a new employee who reports a significant pre-existing hearing loss and also has a diagnosed condition that can affect auditory function, what is the most appropriate initial step for a certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, to take to ensure effective hearing protection and compliance with U.S. occupational health regulations? Option A. Implement a modified audiometric testing schedule for the employee, focusing solely on monitoring for further deterioration without addressing current protection needs. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the employee's current hearing threshold levels and the potential impact of their medical condition on their hearing, followed by an exploration of personalized hearing protection options and assistive listening devices if indicated. Option C. Provide the employee with standard issue hearing protection devices and instruct them to use them as per the company's General Hearing Conservation Program guidelines. Option D. Advise the employee that their pre-existing hearing loss may preclude them from working in noisy environments and suggest they seek alternative employment. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the employee's current hearing threshold levels and the potential impact of their medical condition on their hearing, followed by an exploration of personalized hearing protection options and assistive listening devices if indicated. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the employer's responsibility to provide a safe working environment with the individual needs of an employee who has a pre-existing hearing loss and a condition that could potentially impact their hearing. The Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist, COHC, must navigate these complexities while adhering strictly to U.S. regulatory frameworks, specifically those governed by OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and potentially other relevant federal or state guidelines concerning workplace accommodations and medical conditions. The challenge lies in ensuring that the hearing conservation program is effective for this individual without imposing undue burdens or violating their rights, and without compromising the safety of other workers. Careful judgment is required to implement appropriate accommodations and monitoring strategies that are both effective and compliant. The correct approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the employee's current hearing status, understanding the nature and potential impact of their pre-existing hearing loss and other medical condition on their ability to benefit from standard hearing protection and participate in the hearing conservation program. This includes exploring the use of assistive listening devices, ALD, where appropriate, and considering modifications to communication methods or work environments. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the individual's specific needs as mandated by regulations like the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which requires reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities, and OSHA General Duty Clause, which mandates employers provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. It also aligns with the ethical responsibility of a COHC to protect the hearing health of all employees, including those with special considerations. An incorrect approach would be to assume that standard hearing protection devices, HPD, are sufficient for an individual with pre-existing hearing loss without further evaluation. This fails to acknowledge that pre-existing conditions can affect the effectiveness of standard HPDs and may necessitate alternative or supplementary measures. Ethically and regulatorily, this could lead to inadequate protection and a failure to meet the requirements for reasonable accommodation. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the employee's concerns or the potential impact of their other medical condition on their hearing without a thorough investigation. This disregards the employer's obligation to address potential health and safety risks and could violate the ADA by failing to engage in an interactive process to determine reasonable accommodations. A third incorrect approach would be to implement a hearing conservation program that is overly restrictive or punitive towards the employee due to their pre-existing conditions, without a clear scientific or regulatory basis. This could lead to discrimination and a failure to provide a supportive and inclusive work environment, potentially violating anti-discrimination laws and ethical principles of fairness. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understand the employee's medical history and current hearing status through appropriate audiometric testing and consultation with medical professionals if necessary. Second, engage in an interactive process with the employee to identify specific challenges and potential solutions, considering their input and preferences. Third, research and evaluate available assistive listening devices and other accommodations that are effective and compliant with relevant regulations. Fourth, implement the chosen accommodations and monitor their effectiveness, making adjustments as needed. Finally, document all assessments, communications, and implemented strategies to ensure compliance and provide a record of due diligence. Question 14. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a manufacturing facility has several distinct operational zones, including a fabrication area with intermittent high-intensity machinery, a packaging area with continuous moderate noise, and a quality control lab with occasional transient noise events. A COHC is tasked with conducting a noise survey to evaluate potential hearing hazards. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements for a comprehensive noise survey in this environment? Option A. Prioritize identifying and ranking all potential noise sources within the facility through observation and worker interviews, without conducting any actual noise measurements. Option B. Perform only area noise measurements in each operational zone and assume that these readings accurately represent the noise exposure for all workers within those zones. Option C. Conduct area noise measurements in each operational zone to establish baseline sound levels, then utilize noise mapping to visualize the spatial distribution of noise, and finally implement personal noise monitoring, dosimetry, for workers in areas identified as potentially hazardous, ensuring all equipment is calibrated before use. Option D. Focus solely on conducting personal noise monitoring, dosimetry, for a representative sample of workers across all operational zones without prior area measurements or noise mapping. The correct answer is C. Conduct area noise measurements in each operational zone to establish baseline sound levels, Then utilize noise mapping to visualize the spatial distribution of noise. And finally, implement personal noise monitoring, dosimetry, for workers in areas identified as potentially hazardous, ensuring all equipment is calibrated before use. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, to move beyond simple data collection and apply a nuanced understanding of noise survey methodologies to a complex, dynamic workplace. The presence of multiple, potentially intermittent noise sources, coupled with varying worker tasks and locations, necessitates a strategic approach to noise monitoring that accurately reflects actual exposure. Failure to select the most appropriate methodology can lead to underestimation of risk, non-compliance with regulatory standards, and ultimately, inadequate hearing protection for employees. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased strategy that begins with a broad overview of the workplace noise environment and then drills down to specific exposure assessments. This starts with area noise measurements to identify high noise zones and potential problem areas. Subsequently, noise mapping helps to visualize the spatial distribution of noise and identify dominant sources. Finally, personal noise monitoring, dosimetry, is crucial for accurately assessing individual worker exposure, especially in environments with variable noise levels and worker movement. This multifaceted approach aligns with the principles of effective noise surveys as outlined in occupational safety and health regulations, ensuring that both the overall noise environment and individual exposures are characterized comprehensively. The calibration of equipment at each stage is a fundamental regulatory requirement to ensure data validity and reliability. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that solely relies on area noise measurements without considering individual worker tasks and movement would be incorrect. This fails to account for the fact that noise exposure is personal and can vary significantly even within a designated noisy area, depending on an individual's specific job duties and time spent in different locations. This approach risks underestimating the actual noise dose received by workers. An approach that exclusively uses personal noise monitoring without initial area surveys or noise mapping would also be incorrect. While personal monitoring is essential, conducting it without a foundational understanding of the noise environment can lead to inefficient sampling. It might miss critical intermittent noise sources or fail to identify areas that require broader intervention. Furthermore, without understanding the overall noise landscape, interpreting individual dosimeter readings in context becomes more difficult. An approach that focuses only on identifying and ranking noise sources without performing any actual noise measurements, area or personal, would be fundamentally flawed. While source identification is a vital first step, it does not provide the quantitative data necessary to assess noise exposure levels or determine compliance with regulatory limits. This approach relies on assumptions rather than objective data. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach noise surveys by first understanding the workplace layout, operational procedures, and potential noise-generating activities. This initial understanding informs the selection of appropriate survey methodologies. A systematic process, starting with broad area measurements and noise mapping to identify potential problem zones, followed by targeted personal noise monitoring to quantify individual exposures, is the most robust and compliant strategy. Regular equipment calibration is a non-negotiable prerequisite for all measurement activities. This structured, data-driven approach ensures that the hearing conservation program is based on accurate risk assessments and effectively protects employee hearing. Question 15. Performance analysis shows that a community youth program serving adolescents aged 12-17 years has identified significant noise exposure risks during recreational activities such as concerts, sports events, and personal music listening. As a certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, what is the most effective implementation strategy for hearing loss prevention in this group? Option A. Recommend the use of high-fidelity earplugs for personal music listening only and advise participants to rely on ambient noise levels for other activities. Option B. Focus solely on educating parents about the risks and obtaining their consent for their children to wear hearing protection without direct engagement with the adolescents. Option C. Develop and deliver interactive, age-appropriate educational workshops on noise-induced hearing loss and the proper use of various hearing protection devices, coupled with the provision of a range of comfortable and effective hearing protection options suitable for adolescents. Option D. Distribute a standard informational pamphlet on noise risks and provide generic earplugs to all participants, assuming parents will reinforce the message. The correct answer is C. Develop and deliver interactive, age-appropriate educational workshops on noise-induced hearing loss and the proper use of various hearing protection devices, coupled with the provision of a range of comfortable and effective hearing protection options suitable for adolescents. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, to navigate the complexities of implementing hearing protection strategies for a diverse group of children and adolescents in a non-traditional setting, such as a community youth program. The challenge lies in adapting standard occupational hearing conservation principles to a population with different developmental stages, varying levels of understanding, and potentially less direct supervision than in a typical workplace. Ensuring compliance with regulations designed for adult workers, while effectively engaging and protecting young individuals, requires careful consideration of educational methods, accessibility of protection, and parental involvement. The correct approach involves a multifaceted strategy that prioritizes education tailored to the age and comprehension levels of the children and adolescents, alongside the provision of appropriate and accessible hearing protection devices. This aligns with the fundamental principles of hearing loss prevention, which emphasize both awareness and the use of protective measures. Specifically, the COHC must ensure that the educational materials and methods are engaging and understandable for young audiences, covering the risks of noise exposure from recreational activities and the importance of using hearing protection. Furthermore, making suitable hearing protection readily available and demonstrating its proper use are critical for successful implementation. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes the well-being of a vulnerable population and is consistent with the spirit of occupational health and safety regulations, which aim to prevent harm regardless of the setting. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on distributing hearing protection without adequate education fails to address the root cause of noncompliance, which is often a lack of understanding about the risks and benefits. This overlooks the developmental needs of children and adolescents, who require clear, age-appropriate explanations to internalize the importance of hearing protection. Such an approach risks low adoption rates and continued exposure to hazardous noise levels, violating the ethical duty to protect health. Another incorrect approach that relies exclusively on parental consent and education, without direct engagement with the children and adolescents themselves, is also problematic. While parental involvement is crucial, it does not absolve the COHC of the responsibility to directly inform and educate the young individuals who are at risk. Children and adolescents need to understand the personal implications of noise exposure and the function of hearing protection to make informed choices and develop lifelong healthy habits. This approach may also be insufficient in ensuring consistent use of protection during activities where parents are not present. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes convenience over effectiveness, such as recommending generic earplugs without considering fit or comfort for younger users, is also professionally unsound. The effectiveness of hearing protection is directly linked to its proper fit and consistent use. For children and adolescents, specialized or adjustable hearing protection may be necessary to ensure adequate attenuation and comfort, thereby increasing the likelihood of consistent wear. Failing to consider these practical aspects undermines the goal of hearing loss prevention. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment specific to the environment and the age group, followed by the development of a comprehensive intervention plan. This plan must integrate age-appropriate education, accessible and suitable protective equipment, and strategies for ongoing reinforcement and evaluation. Ethical considerations, particularly the duty of care towards a vulnerable population, should guide all aspects of the implementation. Question 16. Implementation of a comprehensive occupational hearing conservation program requires careful selection of audiometric assessment techniques. When a worker presents with potential hearing difficulties that cannot be definitively assessed by standard pure-tone audiometry due to suspected middle ear issues, which of the following diagnostic sequences best adheres to regulatory requirements and professional best practices for initial evaluation? Option A. proceed directly to auditory brainstem response (ABR) testing to assess the integrity of the auditory nerve and brainstem pathways. Option B. Perform emittance testing, tympanometry, and acoustic reflexes to evaluate middle ear status, followed by pure tone audiometry or other advanced measures as indicated by emittance results. Option C. Conduct autocaustic emissions (O) testing to assess cochlear outer hair cell function, followed by auditory brainstem response (ABR) if OAEs are abnormal. Option D. Administer a self-administered online hearing screening questionnaire to gauge the worker's subjective perception of hearing loss. The correct answer is C. Conduct autocaustic emissions (O) testing to assess cochlear outer hair cell function, followed by auditory brainstem response (ABR) if OAEs are abnormal. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist (COHC) to make a critical decision regarding the interpretation of audiometric data, balancing the need for accurate assessment with the practical limitations of available technology and the specific regulatory requirements for occupational hearing conservation programs. The COHC must ensure that the chosen method aligns with established best practices and regulatory mandates to protect worker hearing. The correct approach involves utilizing emittance testing as a preliminary step to rule out conductive hearing loss before proceeding with other advanced audiometric measures like autocaustic emissions (O) or auditory brainstem response (ABR) for assessing cochlear or neural function. This is the most appropriate professional practice because emittance testing, tympanometry, and acoustic reflexes is a non-invasive, objective measure that can quickly identify middle ear pathologies, e.g., fluid, perforation, ossicular discontinuity, or eustachian tube dysfunction that would invalidate pure tone threshold results or OAE measurements. By first confirming the integrity of the middle ear and the auditory pathway up to the stapes, the COHC ensures that subsequent OAE or ABR testing, if needed, is performed on a functionally sound system, leading to more reliable and interpretable results. This aligns with the principles of accurate diagnostic assessment and the regulatory framework for occupational hearing conservation, which emphasizes reliable data for determining hearing status and the need for intervention. An incorrect approach would be to immediately proceed with OAE testing without first performing emittance testing. This is professionally unacceptable because OAEs are sensitive to middle ear conditions. If a conductive component is present, OAEs may be absent or abnormal, leading to a misinterpretation of the results as sensorineural hearing loss when the primary issue lies in the middle ear. This failure to rule out conductive pathology violates the principle of accurate diagnostic assessment and could lead to inappropriate management decisions, potentially contravening regulatory requirements for proper hearing evaluation. Another incorrect approach would be to solely rely on ABR testing for all workers suspected of hearing issues, bypassing emittance testing and OAEs. While ABR is a valuable tool for assessing the auditory nerve and brainstem, it is more time-consuming and less practical for routine screening or initial assessment in an occupational setting compared to emittance testing. Furthermore, ABR results can also be affected by middle ear pathology. Skipping emittance testing means the ABR results might be confounded by conductive issues, leading to misdiagnosis and potentially unnecessary further investigations or interventions, which is inefficient and does not adhere to a systematic diagnostic approach mandated by best practices in occupational hearing conservation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic, tiered approach to audiometric assessment. First, consider the regulatory requirements for the specific occupational hearing conservation program. Second, employ screening tools that are efficient and can identify potential issues requiring further investigation. Emittance testing serves this purpose effectively by identifying conductive components. Third, based on the results of initial assessments, determine the necessity and appropriate type of advanced audiometric testing, OAEs for cochlear function, ABR for neural pathway integrity. This layered approach ensures diagnostic accuracy, efficiency, and compliance with occupational hearing conservation standards. Question 17. Which approach would be most effective for a certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, to secure adequate funding and staffing for their occupational hearing conservation program when facing significant budget cuts and competing departmental priorities? Option A. focusing exclusively on the technical execution of audiometric testing and noise measurement, assuming that effective technical work will inherently justify the program's resource needs. Option B, implementing immediate reductions in program services, such as decreasing the frequency of audiometric testing and noise monitoring to align with the reduced budget. Option C, submitting a formal request for an increased budget based on the essential nature of hearing conservation, without providing specific financial justifications or performance metrics. Option D, presenting a detailed analysis of the program's return on investment, highlighting cost savings from prevented hearing loss and regulatory compliance, supported by data on noise exposure and audiometric outcomes. The correct answer is D, presenting a detailed analysis of the program's return on investment, highlighting cost savings from prevented hearing loss and regulatory compliance, supported by data on noise exposure and audiometric outcomes. Explanation: scenario analysis. Managing an occupational hearing conservation program presents a significant challenge when faced with budget constraints and competing departmental priorities. The Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist, COHC, must balance the legal and ethical obligations to protect employee hearing with the practical realities of resource allocation. This requires strategic planning, effective communication with management, and a thorough understanding of the program's impact and value. Failure to adequately fund or staff the program can lead to noncompliance, increased risk of hearing loss, and potential legal liabilities. Correct approach analysis. The most effective approach involves demonstrating the program's return on investment (ROI) and its critical role in regulatory compliance and employee well-being. This requires the COHC to proactively gather data on the program's effectiveness, such as noise exposure levels, audiometric test results, and the incidence of noise-induced hearing loss. This data should be presented to management in a clear, concise manner, highlighting how the program mitigates risks, reduces potential workers' compensation claims, and ensures adherence to OSHA standards. Emphasizing the long-term cost savings associated with preventing hearing loss, compared to the costs of remediation or litigation, is crucial. This approach aligns with the ethical duty of the COHC to advocate for the health and safety of employees and the regulatory requirement to maintain a compliant hearing conservation program. Incorrect approach is analysis. Simply requesting an increased budget without providing supporting data or demonstrating the program's value is unlikely to be successful. Management may perceive this as an unfunded mandate or a departmental wish list, leading to rejection. This approach fails to engage management strategically and neglects the need to justify resource allocation based on demonstrable benefits and risks. Another ineffective approach is to reduce program services to fit the existing budget without a thorough risk assessment. This could involve cutting back on audiometric testing frequency, reducing noise monitoring, or limiting employee training. Such actions directly contravene OSHA requirements for a comprehensive hearing conservation program and significantly increase the risk of employees developing noise-induced hearing loss, leading to potential regulatory violations and increased liability. Focusing solely on the technical aspects of hearing conservation without addressing the administrative and financial challenges is also insufficient. While technical expertise is vital, a COHC must also be a skilled program manager. Ignoring the need for budget advocacy and strategic communication with leadership means the program may not receive the necessary resources to operate effectively, even with excellent technical execution. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should adopt a data-driven, advocacy-focused approach. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory requirements thoroughly, e.g., OSHA 29 CFR 1910-95. 2. Quantifying the risks associated with inadequate program funding, e.g., potential for hearing loss, increased claims, fines. 3. Demonstrating the program's value proposition, including cost savings and risk reduction. 4. Communicating effectively with stakeholders, particularly management, using clear business-oriented language. 5. Proactively seeking solutions that align with both regulatory mandates and organizational financial realities. Question 18. The analysis reveals that a manufacturing plant has a diverse workforce with varying levels of English proficiency and educational backgrounds. The Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist, COHC, is tasked with developing and delivering a mandatory hearing conservation training program. The COHC must decide on the most effective communication and training strategy to ensure all employees understand the risks of noise exposure and the importance of hearing protection. which approach best fulfills the regulatory requirements and ethical obligations for this training. Option A. Conduct a brief, high-level overview of noise hazards and personal protective equipment, focusing on the minimum information required by regulations to quickly complete the training for all employees. Option B. Deliver a standardized lecture-based training session using technical terminology, assuming all employees will understand the core concepts through the provided written handouts. Option C. Utilize a single, visually engaging presentation with minimal verbal explanation, relying on the assumption that the visual elements alone will convey all necessary information effectively. Option D. Develop a comprehensive training program that includes translated materials, uses simple language, incorporates visual aids like diagrams and demonstrations, and allows for interactive question and answer sessions to address individual concerns and clarify information. Correct answer is D. Develop a comprehensive training program that includes translated materials, uses simple language, incorporates visual aids like diagrams and demonstrations, and allows for interactive question and answer sessions to address individual concerns and clarify information. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the legal mandate of providing effective hearing conservation training with the ethical obligation to ensure all employees, regardless of their background or learning style, receive comprehensible and actionable information. The Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist, COHC, must navigate potential communication barriers and ensure compliance with regulatory requirements for training content and delivery. The correct approach involves tailoring communication to the specific needs of the audience, utilizing visual aids to reinforce key messages, and delivering information in a clear and concise manner. This aligns with the fundamental principles of effective adult education and the regulatory framework's implicit requirement for training to be understood and retained. Specifically, regulations often mandate that training be understandable and effective, which necessitates adapting methods to the learner. Ethically, this approach demonstrates respect for the individual learner and a commitment to their safety and well-being by ensuring they can actively participate in their hearing protection. An approach that relies solely on a standardized, lecture-based presentation without considering language barriers or literacy levels fails to meet the spirit and often the letter of regulatory requirements for effective training. This can lead to a situation where employees are technically trained but lack the actual knowledge to implement hearing conservation practices, creating a significant safety risk and potential noncompliance. An approach that uses overly technical jargon without explanation, even with visual aids, can alienate or confuse employees, rendering the training ineffective. While visual aids are beneficial, their utility is diminished if the accompanying verbal or written information is inaccessible. This also falls short of the regulatory expectation for understandable training. An approach that prioritizes speed and completion over comprehension, perhaps by rushing through the material or skipping sections deemed less critical, directly violates the mandate for effective training. The goal is not merely to deliver information, but to ensure it is understood and can be applied. This approach risks creating a false sense of compliance while leaving employees vulnerable. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the target audience and their potential learning needs and barriers. This involves assessing factors such as language proficiency, educational background, and prior knowledge. The next step is to select training methods and materials that are most likely to resonate with this specific audience, incorporating a variety of techniques like interactive discussions, demonstrations, and visual aids. Finally, a robust evaluation process should be implemented to gauge comprehension and identify areas for improvement in future training sessions, ensuring continuous enhancement of the hearing conservation program. Question 19. Governance review demonstrates that a residential community adjacent to a mixed-use industrial zone is experiencing increased complaints regarding noise. As a certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, operating under U.S. regulatory guidelines, which approach best addresses the community's concerns while adhering to established protocols for noise pollution control. Option A. Focus mitigation efforts on the most easily identifiable noise source, such as traffic noise, without conducting a full noise assessment or verifying compliance with specific noise ordinance limits. Option B. Rely on resident complaints to identify the primary noise source and advocate for its immediate cessation or significant reduction, regardless of measured noise levels or specific ordinance provisions. Option C. Advise community leaders to pursue legal action against all industrial facilities within the zone based on general concerns about industrial noise, without first establishing specific ordinance violations through objective measurement. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive noise survey to identify and quantify all significant noise sources. Compare measured levels to applicable U.S. federal, state, and local noise ordinances, and recommend specific, ordinance-compliant mitigation strategies for identified exceedances. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive noise survey to identify and quantify all significant noise sources. Compare measured levels to applicable U.S. federal, state, and local noise ordinances, and recommend specific, ordinance-compliant mitigation strategies for identified exceedances. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing public health concerns related to noise exposure with the practical realities of community life and the limitations of existing regulatory frameworks. A certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, must apply their knowledge of noise measurement, effects, and control strategies within the specific legal and ethical boundaries of their jurisdiction. The challenge lies in identifying the most effective and compliant approach to address community noise issues, which often involve multiple stakeholders and diverse noise sources. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of community noise sources, their impact, and the relevant noise ordinances. This includes accurate noise monitoring, comparison of measured levels to established ordinance limits, and the identification of specific noise sources that exceed these limits. The COHC must then recommend control strategies that are both technically feasible and legally permissible under the applicable U.S. regulations, such as those promulgated by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, or state/local agencies that have adopted similar standards for community noise. This approach prioritizes evidence-based decision-making and adherence to legal requirements, ensuring that interventions are justified and effective in protecting public health from noise pollution. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or public perception without objective measurement fails to meet the evidentiary standards required by noise ordinances. This can lead to ineffective or legally indefensible interventions. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on the most prominent or easily identifiable noise source, while ignoring others that may also contribute to exceeding ordinance limits, is incomplete and may not fully resolve the community noise problem. Furthermore, recommending control measures that are not supported by the specific provisions of the local noise ordinance or that exceed the authority granted to the COHC represents a failure to adhere to the regulatory framework. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured process. First, thoroughly understand the specific U.S. regulatory framework governing community noise in the relevant jurisdiction. Second, conduct objective, scientifically sound noise measurements to characterize the problem. Third, compare these measurements against the established legal limits. Fourth, identify the specific sources contributing to non-compliance. Finally, propose control strategies that are compliant with the regulations, technically sound, and ethically responsible, prioritizing the health and well-being of the community. Question 20. Operational review demonstrates that an employee scheduled for a baseline audiogram presents with a significant amount of visible cerumen in the external auditory canal, partially obstructing the view of the tympanic membrane. The employee reports no subjective hearing difficulties. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC? Option A. Refer the employee to a qualified medical professional for cerumen removal prior to conducting the audiometric test. Option B. Inform the employee that their hearing cannot be tested due to the cerumen and reschedule the appointment for an unspecified future date. Option C. Proceed with the audiometric testing as scheduled, documenting the presence of cerumen in the employee's record. Option D. Attempt to remove the cerumen using standard otoscopic instruments to ensure a clear view of the tympanic membrane. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the audiometric testing as scheduled, documenting the presence of cerumen in the employee's record. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the certified occupational hearing conservationist, COHC, to apply their knowledge of auditory anatomy and physiology to a practical workplace situation involving potential exposure to noise and the presence of cerumen. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the impact of these factors on an individual's hearing and determining the appropriate course of action within the scope of practice and regulatory guidelines. Careful judgment is required to differentiate between normal physiological variations, the effects of noise exposure, and the potential impact of cerumen on audiometric testing. The correct approach involves recognizing that cerumen impaction can significantly interfere with accurate audiometric threshold determination. By identifying the presence of cerumen and understanding its potential to attenuate sound, the COHC correctly prioritizes its management. This aligns with the ethical responsibility to ensure the validity and reliability of hearing test results. Furthermore, regulatory frameworks for occupational hearing conservation, such as those enforced by OSHA in the U.S., which is the likely jurisdiction for COHC certification, mandate that audiometric testing be conducted under conditions that yield accurate results. If cerumen is suspected to be interfering, the standard procedure is to refer the individual for cerumen removal by a qualified medical professional before retesting. This ensures that any subsequent audiogram accurately reflects the individual's hearing sensitivity without artifactual masking from cerumen. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with audiometric testing despite the visible presence of cerumen. This fails to uphold the integrity of the testing process. Regulatory guidelines emphasize the importance of accurate baseline and ongoing audiograms for effective hearing conservation programs. Conducting a test under suboptimal conditions, where cerumen is known to be a potential confounder, violates the principle of obtaining reliable data. This could lead to misdiagnosis of hearing loss, inappropriate intervention strategies, and ultimately, a compromised hearing conservation program. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to remove the cerumen personally without the appropriate medical training or authorization. While the COHC understands the function of the outer ear and cerumen, the scope of practice for a COHC typically does not include medical procedures like cerumen removal. Attempting such a procedure could lead to injury to the external auditory canal or tympanic membrane, violating ethical standards of care and potentially exceeding the legal scope of practice. A third incorrect approach would be to ignore the cerumen and simply document its presence without taking further action. This neglects the potential impact of the cerumen on the audiometric results. The purpose of a hearing conservation program is to identify and manage hearing loss. If the testing is compromised by an external factor like cerumen, the program's effectiveness is undermined. The COHC has a professional responsibility to ensure that the data collected is meaningful and actionable. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the individual's auditory system, considering both external factors and internal physiological status. This includes a thorough otoscopic examination to identify any conditions that might affect hearing or audiometric testing. When an impediment like cerumen is observed, the professional must assess its potential impact on the planned assessment. The decision-making framework should prioritize the integrity of the diagnostic process, adherence to regulatory requirements for accurate testing, and the ethical obligation to act in the best interest of the individual's health and safety. If a condition is identified that compromises testing or falls outside the COHC scope of practice, the appropriate action is referral to a qualified medical professional.